Hi everyone. I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we drift into the past, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from? What's the time where you are right now? I always find it fascinating to imagine this same story being heard by people scattered across different corners of the world. Some may be just waking up, others about to sleep. Wherever you are, I hope this moment feels calm. Because tonight, we're going back. Far back. To America, around the year 1803. It was a world without engines, without humming wires or glowing screens. Nights were darker than you can imagine, lit only by the soft flicker of a tallow candle or the orange heartbeat of a hearth. Roads were mud and dust, and distances felt immense, not because the land was vast, but because every journey was slow. Letters took weeks to arrive, and sometimes months. People spoke more softly, moved more slowly, and thought more deeply about the few things that filled their days. Our story begins in the gentle hills of Pennsylvania, where a small wooden farmhouse stood by the edge of a forest. The paint had long faded, the roof patched with different shades of weathered shingles. In summer, wildflowers grew thick around its steps, and bees floated lazily through the still air. In winter, snow buried the fence posts and muffled every sound except the slow crack of the firewood splitting in the hearth. Inside lived the Carter family, people of quiet endurance. Thomas Carter, the father, had been born just a few years before the Revolution ended. He still remembered stories told by old soldiers who came through the tavern, about frozen camps and desperate marches, and a country that wasn't yet certain it could survive. His wife, Mary, was softer in spirit but stronger in will. Her hands were always busy, spinning wool, kneading bread, stitching torn sleeves, the kind of endless, invisible work that held a household together. And then there was their son, Elias. He was just a boy in the year 1803, slender and curious, with a calm that made him seem older than his years. He loved the feel of soil between his fingers, the sound of rain on the roof, and the strange echoing silence that filled the woods at dusk. When he wasn't working, he wandered, down toward the creek, or through the birch trees, or up to the rocky ridge where the whole valley opened before him like a painted world. That valley. It was still half wild then. The forests stretched for miles. The smell of pine resin hung in the air, and the wind that moved through the branches carried the faint cry of distant animals. Wolves, sometimes. Eagles, often. At night, the stars burned brighter than any lantern. Elias would stand outside, wrapped in a wool blanket, and look up until his neck ached. He liked to imagine those same stars had watched the Revolution, had watched the first settlers come through these woods, and would go on watching long after he was gone. Life in 1800s America wasn't easy, but it was full. Every sound, every smell, every task had weight. The morning began not with a clock, but with the rooster's cry, and the rhythm of chores that shaped the day. You could tell the hour by the slant of sunlight through the kitchen window, or by the way the shadows stretched across the barn floor. There was no rush, because rushing served no purpose. The world moved at the pace of a plow horse, at the rhythm of footsteps on dirt. Elias's father rose before dawn, when the house was still gray and cold. He would light the fire, his breath visible in the chill air, and soon the scent of smoke and bread would fill the rooms. Mary would hum softly while stirring cornmeal, her voice blending with the crackle of the hearth. Elias would wake to that sound, the sound of a world beginning, and sit quietly on the edge of his bed, feeling the wooden floor creak beneath his bare feet. Breakfast was simple: porridge, milk, and sometimes apples baked in honey if the harvest had been good. But in that simplicity was something golden, the small rituals that made life feel whole. The world beyond their valley might have been changing, presidents elected, borders drawn, but for the Carters, history was something distant. What mattered was the field, the weather, and the harvest. Elias often listened to his father speak of the land as if it were a living thing. "Soil remembers," Thomas would say. "Treat it right, and it'll treat you right back." There was a reverence in his tone, a kind of faith older than any church. The earth was sacred, not in words, but in labor. Every furrow, every planted seed, every blister earned from the handle of a hoe was a prayer for the future. But there was also wonder. Because even in that quiet, faraway corner of early America, whispers of the wider world drifted in, like smoke on a still morning. Travelers passing through the tavern spoke of new states joining the Union, of cities growing fast and tall, of men heading west toward lands no map could yet describe. Elias listened with wide eyes. To him, those stories sounded like dreams, shimmering, unreachable dreams told beside the fire while the night pressed close around the house. Sometimes, after the day's work was done, he would climb the hill alone and look toward the horizon, where the light faded into blue haze. He imagined what lay beyond: new rivers, forests, towns with cobbled streets, and people he'd never meet. Somewhere, he thought, the world must be moving faster. Somewhere, men might be building machines, inventing things, discovering strange materials and new ways of living. But here in his valley, time seemed to hold its breath. The air felt ancient, untouched. In that stillness, Elias began to understand something he would never quite forget. That to live in the early 1800s was to live suspended between two worlds, one fading, one not yet born. The old ways still ruled every hour, but the future was stirring somewhere just beyond the hills. And though he didn't know it yet, that quiet valley, and the life he lived there, would one day stand on the edge of a great transformation. A change that would come not with a roar, but with a slow, unstoppable hum of iron and steam. But for now, the only sound was the wind in the trees, the creak of the barn door, and the soft rhythm of a world still half asleep. The mornings came quietly in those years, not like they do now, with alarms and screens and the impatient pulse of the modern day. In 1800s America, morning slipped into the world like a whisper. There was no sharp beginning, only the gradual softening of darkness into gray, and then, little by little, into gold. Elias woke to the sounds of life before he ever opened his eyes. The faint rustle of his mother's skirts in the kitchen, the uneven clink of tin bowls being set on the table, the rhythmic sweep of his father's broom on the wooden floor. Somewhere outside, a rooster was already shouting at the pale sky, and the cow in the barn lowed softly, hungry and patient. The air inside the farmhouse was cold enough to make his breath visible. He would pull on his wool shirt, rough against the skin, and tie his boots with fingers still stiff from sleep. There was no thought of comfort, only habit. Everyone rose early, because the daylight was precious, and the world would not wait. When Elias stepped outside, the morning struck him full of scent. Damp earth, wood smoke, the sweetness of hay, the faint sharpness of iron from the plow leaning against the wall. He could hear the river murmuring in the distance, slow and brown, winding through the valley like an old animal. The world seemed wide and endless, yet every corner of it was known to him. The split rail fence, the leaning oak, the trail that disappeared into the woods. A thin mist floated over the fields, and as the first sunlight broke through the trees, it turned gold and shivered like glass. Somewhere far off, a bell rang, the sound from the church in the next town, carried on the wind. The bell meant nothing in particular, but Elias always paused when he heard it. It reminded him that there were others, unseen but near, beginning their mornings too. The world, vast as it was, had its quiet rhythm. Breakfast was humble but steady, cornbread still warm from the pan, a small wedge of cheese, and milk drawn fresh from the cow. His mother would pour the milk into a clay cup, its rim chipped from years of use, and say a few soft words of thanks before anyone took a bite. They didn't speak much while eating, not from coldness, but from peace. The only sounds were the ticking of the old wooden clock and the gentle scrape of spoons on bowls. After breakfast came the work. And work in those years was the shape of life itself. The fields demanded attention from sunrise to dusk. There were no machines to ease the burden, no shortcuts, no conveniences. The oxen moved slowly through the damp earth, pulling the plow with a tired strength that felt almost human. Elias would walk behind, gripping the wooden handles, his boots sinking into the mud, the smell of soil rising thick around him. The plow's iron blade hissed as it cut through the ground, turning it over in heavy curls. Sometimes, his father would work beside him in silence, only pausing to point at the horizon or test the earth with his hands. "Good soil this year," he would murmur, almost to himself. And Elias would nod, even though he wasn't sure how one could tell. But over time, he learned. The land spoke in small ways: the way water pooled after rain, the shade of the grass, the weight of the wind. You could live your whole life within a single valley and never stop learning its moods. As the morning went on, the sun rose higher and the mist lifted. The air filled with the hum of insects and the faint creak of leather harnesses. In the distance, he could see the smoke of another farm rising in a soft column, pale against the blue. The sound of an axe echoed now and then, sharp, rhythmic, lonely. It was a sound that belonged to that age, the steady heartbeat of work. By midday, his shirt was damp with sweat and streaked with dust. He would rest beneath a tree, drinking water from a wooden canteen that tasted faintly of sap. The food his mother packed, cold bread, sometimes an apple, was never enough to fill him, but hunger was part of the day. He would lie back for a few minutes, feeling the cool shade move across his face, and watch the clouds drifting above the hills. Those clouds, they moved so slowly then. Or maybe it was time itself that moved differently. There was no clock to hurry him, no noise to steal his thoughts. Only the sigh of wind in the grass, and the far-off cry of a hawk circling somewhere unseen. When the sun reached its highest point, Elias often felt the strange pull of thought, that distant, nameless yearning that comes when the body is tired but the mind is awake. He would imagine distant places he had heard about: New York, where ships filled the harbor and streets were lit with lamps at night; Virginia, with its tobacco fields stretching into the haze; or even farther, the wild lands beyond the mountains where no towns yet stood. These places were only names to him, but they shimmered in his imagination like stars above the black woods. Sometimes, when travelers passed through the village, Elias would listen closely to their accents and stories. He loved the way words changed from one place to another, how a single sentence could sound foreign though it spoke the same language. The visitors told of strange things: steamboats on wide rivers, grand hotels, cities where thousands of people lived within earshot of one another. It all sounded impossible. The world he knew had boundaries: the ridge to the east, the forest to the west, and the dirt road that wound toward the town. When evening began to fall, he and his father would lead the oxen back to the barn. The animals' breath steamed in the cool air, and their hooves thudded softly on the ground. Inside, the barn smelled of hay, leather, and quiet, that deep, soft quiet that belongs only to animals and wood. They would hang the tools on the wall, close the doors, and stand for a moment in the dim light before heading back to the house. Dinner was the day's true reward. Mary would serve stew cooked for hours, thick with beans and herbs, the flavor rich and deep. Sometimes she would talk about her garden, or ask Elias about the fields. Other times, they said nothing at all, just listened to the crickets starting their evening song outside the open window. It was then, in that hour between day and night, that he felt closest to something sacred, not in the church sense, but in the quiet knowledge that the world was vast, old, and endlessly alive. He didn't think of history, or the passing of years, or the shape of the country changing. He only thought of how the stars would soon appear, and how tomorrow the same sun would rise again, painting the fields gold just as it always had. In those calm, repeating days, the young century was still a mystery. America was young, restless, and full of unspoken dreams. But in Elias's small valley, time seemed eternal, an unbroken circle of labor and rest, silence and sound, birth and decay. And though he did not yet know it, Those gentle mornings, the smell of soil, the cry of the rooster, the warmth of a shared meal, would one day become memories of a vanished world. A world about to wake from its long, quiet sleep. The road to town was only 7 miles, but in those days, 7 miles could feel like a journey through another world. It wound between quiet farms, over a shallow creek, and through long stretches of forest where sunlight flickered in thin stripes through the trees. The wagon wheels creaked, the horses' hooves thudded softly against the dirt, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. Elias sat beside his father on the wagon bench, watching the land roll by. Every bend of the road was familiar, the leaning oak struck by lightning years ago, the broken fence mended again and again, the old milestone with numbers half worn away by rain. Yet each trip felt slightly different, depending on the season. In spring the field shimmered green, in summer the air buzzed with insects, in autumn the trees burned with color like lanterns. Today the first cool wind of fall had arrived, and dry leaves chased the wagon wheels in restless swirls. Thomas didn't speak much while traveling. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands firm on the reins. But Elias liked the silence. It left room for the rhythm of the world, the squeak of the harness, the rattle of tools in the back, the distant cry of a hawk somewhere high above. By late morning, they reached the town, Millfield, though everyone simply called it the crossroads. It wasn't much more than a cluster of wooden buildings along the main street. A tavern, a blacksmith shop, a general store, and a small church with a white steeple that caught the sun like a blade. But to Elias, it felt enormous. It was the sound that made it so, the chatter of people, the clatter of horses, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer echoing like a heartbeat through the air. The smell was a strange mix of everything: hay, smoke, leather, iron, and the sweet tang of molasses from the barrels stacked outside the store. There was even faintly the smell of the river, that cool mineral scent that drifted up from the docks where goods arrived by barge from distant towns. Elias jumped down from the wagon, his boots landing in the dust. The ground here was worn hard by countless wheels and feet. He looked around, taking in every face. Most of the people he recognized: farmers, peddlers, their wives and children. But now and then a stranger appeared, and those were the ones who caught his imagination. Men with different hats, different accents, clothes cut in city styles. They brought with them rumors and stories, each one sounding like a fragment of another universe. At the general store, his father traded sacks of grain for coffee, salt, and nails. Elias wandered outside to watch a man selling handmade combs from a cart. The man had come from Philadelphia, he said, where the streets were paved with stone and lit with gas lamps. Elias had never seen such a thing, and the idea of a street that shone at night felt almost magical. The man noticed his curiosity and smiled. "You've never been to the city, have you, son?" Elias shook his head. "Well," the man said, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret, "it's not all it's made out to be. There's beauty there, yes, but also smoke thick as soup and noise that never ends. Sometimes, when I'm there, I miss the silence you've got out here." Elias thought about that all day. He liked the idea that silence could be something people missed. He had always taken it for granted. The quiet mornings, the slow evenings, the way sound carried far across the valley at night. Maybe it was worth more than he knew. They stopped at the tavern for midday rest. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of ale, wood, and roasted meat. Men talked in low voices about crops, prices, and the weather, always the weather. But in a corner, two older men spoke of something else. "Did you hear about the Louisiana Purchase?" one said. Elias turned slightly to listen. "The president bought all that land from the French. They say it's bigger than the whole country put together." "Land no one's ever seen," the other man said, shaking his head. "Wild country. Some say you could ride for months and never find an end to it." Elias's imagination caught fire. Land beyond the edge of maps. Mountains, rivers, forests that no one could name. He pictured it in his mind. Sunlight glinting on endless plains, strange animals moving through tall grass, the wind carrying the smell of freedom. Later, outside, his father lifted a sack of nails onto the wagon. "Thinking about something?" he asked. Elias hesitated. "Do you think people will really go there? Out west?" Thomas looked at him for a moment, squinting in the light. "People will always go where the land is new," he said. "But new land doesn't mean an easy life." They rode home slowly that evening, the wagon heavy with supplies. The sun dropped low behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Elias sat quietly, the reins loose in his father's hands, and watched the world fade into that familiar twilight he loved. But he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd heard, about the vastness beyond the mountains, the unknown waiting in silence. It stirred something deep in him, a quiet restlessness. For the first time, the valley didn't feel infinite. It felt like a small island in a much larger sea. As they passed the old oak at the crossroads, he looked back once more at the road leading west. Dark now, lined with trees and whispering with the sound of wind. Somewhere out there, he thought, the world was changing. He could almost feel it, like a current moving beneath the calm surface of his days. When they reached home, the lamps were already lit, and his mother stood on the porch with her apron folded in her hands. The smell of stew drifted out through the door. Elias climbed down from the wagon, feeling the cool night settle around him. He could see the stars beginning to appear, one by one, above the ridge. As he walked inside, he realized that every journey, even a short one, left him slightly changed. The town, the strangers, the rumors of faraway places. They were small pieces of a larger story, a story the whole country was slowly writing, mile by mile, road by road. He didn't know it yet, but that story, the restless story of America itself, was only beginning. As autumn deepened, the world around the valley grew stiller, and the nights came sooner. The leaves turned from green to fire and then to ash, until the hills were dressed in gold and red, like a dying sun stretched across the earth. The air carried the smell of wood smoke and frost. Each evening, Elias could see faint plumes rising from distant chimneys, scattered signs of life stitched across the wide darkening land. He was 19 that year, tall and strong from work, but still quiet, still wondering what lay beyond the edges of the maps he'd seen in the schoolhouse. The talk of the town had changed since that day in Millfield. Everywhere, people spoke of the West. It was a word that shimmered with mystery, the West. Not a direction, but a dream. Men arrived from far places, passing through on their way to new lands. Men who looked as though the wilderness itself had carved them from stone. Their clothes were patched and weather-stained, their eyes sharp as flint. They came with stories of places so wide and empty that the sky itself seemed to bend closer to the earth. They spoke of rivers broad as oceans, mountains that glowed pink in the sunrise, forests untouched since the beginning of time. At night, in the tavern, Elias would sit near the back and listen. The voices of the travelers drifted like smoke through the low-lit room. One man told of seeing buffalo herds so vast they darkened the horizon for hours. Another spoke of silence so deep that you could hear your own heartbeat echoing against the rocks. Others spoke of danger, of sudden storms, wolves, sickness, and the loneliness that could crush a man's spirit as surely as hunger. Still, even the dangers sounded beautiful to Elias. He imagined himself walking beneath endless skies, the air so clean it hurt to breathe. He could see it clearly, the wagon trails winding into the unknown, the stars mirrored in rivers, the whisper of the wind moving through tall prairie grass. Sometimes, when the talk died down and the fire in the tavern burned low, one of the older men would speak in a softer tone, warning the younger ones that the West was not as empty as people like to say. "There are people out there," they would murmur. "Tribes who have lived there since before the first ship touched the eastern shore. They do not forget easily when strangers come. Those words stayed with Elias. The maps he'd seen showed blank spaces labeled territory or frontier, but now he began to understand that those spaces were not truly empty. They were full of lives, languages, stories older than the nation itself. One afternoon, a trapper named Reed came through the valley. He was tall, his beard streaked with gray, his face half hidden by the shadow of his hat. His coat was made of animal hide, and he carried the smell of campfire and pine needles. Elias helped him fix a broken wagon wheel, and in return, the man stayed for supper. They ate quietly at first, the fire popping in the hearth. Then Reed began to speak, not in the loud, boastful tone of the tavern men, but low and calm, like someone speaking a prayer. He told of the northern forests, where the trees stood so thick that daylight barely reached the ground. He told of sleeping beside frozen rivers, of hearing wolves sing in the distance like a chorus. Elias asked him what the West truly looked like. Reed leaned back, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "It looks like freedom," he said. "But freedom's a wild thing. It's not gentle, and it doesn't care if you live or die." The words struck Elias deeply. He thought about them for days afterward, while chopping wood, while walking the fence line, while lying awake at night. Freedom. It sounded beautiful but heavy, like something that could lift you or break you. As winter set in, travelers became rare, and the roads turned to ice. The days were short, the sky pale as tin. Elias helped his father repair tools, feed the animals, and mend fences, but his mind kept drifting westward. He could almost hear the echo of that vast, unseen land in the sigh of the wind. Sometimes, he would climb the ridge at dusk, where the trees gave way to open air, and watch the horizon darken. The sky in winter was immense, clear, cold, endless. It made him feel small, but in a way that filled him with wonder. Somewhere beyond that horizon, men were moving, carving new paths, seeing things no one here could imagine. Down in the valley, the Carter house glowed like a lantern in the dark. The smell of stew drifted through the chimney, and the sound of his mother's spinning wheel whispered against the walls. Inside, everything was warm and certain. The same tasks, the same faces, the same steady rhythm. But outside, the wind spoke differently. It carried hints of something coming, not a storm, but a change. One night, during the first snowfall, Elias stood by the window and watched the flakes fall against the glass. The world outside disappeared into white silence. He thought about how this same snow might be falling 1,000 miles away, on plains no one had named yet, on rivers no one had crossed, on the roofs of log cabins where other families sat by fires just like his. The thought made him feel both connected and distant, like one thread in an enormous invisible web. As the weeks passed, stories of the West kept arriving, of new settlements, of wagons setting out across the mountains, of fortunes made and lost. Some people in Millfield were already preparing to go. They sold their land, packed their wagons, and vanished down the road, their faces filled with a mix of hope and fear. That winter, as snow piled high around the farm and the nights stretched long, Elias began to keep a small journal. He wrote by candlelight, using ink his mother made from walnut shells. The pages filled with notes about the land, the weather, the harvest, the shapes of clouds. But sometimes in the margins, he sketched mountains he'd never seen and rivers he could only imagine. He didn't know why he did it, only that something inside him was preparing for a world that was growing larger every day. And though the farmhouse walls were thick and the snow deep outside, the wind still found its way through the cracks, carrying whispers of the frontier, the shadow of a new America rising just beyond the edge of sight. Winter settled over the valley like a blanket, heavy and soundless. By December, the world had turned to stillness, the creek frozen, the trees rimmed with frost, the fields buried under pale, untouched snow. Smoke rose in thin, straight lines from every chimney, vanishing into the gray sky. Inside the Carter farmhouse, the air smelled of pine wood and baking bread. The fire burned low in the hearth, throwing red light across the floorboards and making the shadows dance on the walls. Each evening, as the daylight faded by late afternoon, the family gathered near the fire: Elias, his mother, his father, and his younger sister Lydia. Outside, the cold crept closer, but inside was a world of its own. The hiss of the logs, the faint creak of the rocking chair, the rhythmic turn of Lydia's knitting needles. These were the sounds that marked the hours. Time felt slower in winter. The world shrank to the size of a room, and life became the small rituals that carried people through the dark months. On nights when the wind howled against the shutters, Elias's father liked to tell stories. He had fought as a young man in the closing days of the Revolution, though he rarely spoke of battles. What he remembered most, he said, was the cold. The kind that makes a man forget his own name, he would say, staring into the fire. We slept on frozen ground. Woke up with frost on our blankets. But then he would smile, faintly, as if remembering something softer beneath the hardship. Still, he'd add, we believed in something. That's what kept us warm. Elias had heard the stories before, yet he never tired of them. They weren't told like grand history, not about heroes or glory, but about small things: the smell of smoke and wet wool, the sound of snow falling on tents, the taste of bread shared between hungry men. Those details felt more real than anything in the books. They made the past seem alive, still breathing in the cracks of the present. His mother's stories were different. She told of the old country, her grandparents' world in England, long before they crossed the ocean. Her voice would lower when she spoke of the voyage, the endless weeks of gray water, the smell of salt and sickness. They said the sky seemed larger here, she murmured once, as though God had stretched it wider just for the new world. Then she would speak of her own childhood, of summers spent near the orchard, of the first spinning wheel her father built. Her stories were softer, shaped by rhythm and memory rather than fact. She told them slowly, weaving them together like threads. Lydia, only 12, would listen with wide eyes. She loved the tales of spirits and signs, the ones their mother said came from old country folklore. She told of ghost lights that wandered through the woods, of bells that rang by themselves, of dreams that foretold births and deaths. Elias smiled at her fascination, though sometimes, when the wind moaned through the cracks, he too felt the unease those stories carried. On the coldest nights, when the snow piled high against the door, the whole family sat close, wrapped in blankets. The fire crackled, and their world became smaller still, just light, warmth, and the sound of voices in the dark. Outside, the valley slept under its coat of ice. No birds sang, no footsteps broke the snow. Only the river, deep beneath its frozen skin, still moved, whispering faintly in its sleep. Sometimes, Elias would step outside before bed. The cold would strike like glass, stealing his breath. The sky above was black and infinite, scattered with stars so sharp they looked like frost. In that stillness, he could hear everything: the faint pop of ice in the creek of the barn wood, the far-off cry of an owl. The silence was so deep it seemed almost holy. He would stand there until his fingers went numb, staring westward. Even under the snow, he felt the land's quiet strength, as though it was waiting for something. One evening, near midwinter, their neighbor Mr. Pritchard came to visit. He was an old man, white-haired and bent, his eyes pale and watery. He had been among the valley's first settlers, arriving when there were still wolves in the hills and only a handful of cabins by the river. As he thawed his hands by the fire, he began to speak of the early days. His voice was thin but steady. There were nights, he said, when we could hear drums in the distance. Don't know if they were real or if the wind was playing tricks. Sometimes we'd find tracks we didn't recognize. Not deer, not bear. Big, human-like, but wrong somehow. Lydia gasped, and their mother frowned at him. but Mr. Pritchard only chuckled softly. "Oh, I don't mean monsters, girl. Just the wilderness reminding us we weren't alone." He poked the fire with his cane. "This land's old. Older than any of us. And it remembers." That phrase, "the land remembers," stayed with Elias long after the old man left. He thought of it whenever the wind passed over the fields, or when he looked at the trees half buried in snow. The land did seem to remember, the people who had come and gone, the storms, the stories whispered by travelers, the small footprints that faded and were remade each year. It made him feel both comforted and unsettled, as though everything he did was being quietly watched by something vast and ancient. On Christmas Eve, the Carters gathered with a few neighbors who lived within walking distance. They met in the church, a small wooden building that smelled of candle wax and cold pine. Inside, they sang hymns softly, their breath forming clouds in the air. When the singing ended, they lingered, sharing food and laughter, the sound echoing warmly through the rafters. The first sign that winter was ending came not from the sun, but from the sound. It was faint at first, a trickle, then a murmur, as the frozen creek began to breathe again beneath its crust of ice. Days grew a little longer, and the light shifted from the pale silver of winter to the softer gold of early spring. Snow retreated from the fields, leaving behind dark, heavy earth that steamed under the noon warmth. Inside the Carter farmhouse, windows were cracked open for the first time in months. The air that drifted and smelled of thawing soil and wet bark, sharp, raw, alive. Mary Carter wiped down the sills and let the curtains flutter in the breeze. "The world's waking up again," she said softly. "Listen." And Elias did listen. He heard water dripping from the eaves, the distant rush of the river, the hollow tap of melting icicles falling from the barn roof. After months of silence, the sound felt like music, hesitant, uneven, but full of promise. The valley changed quickly. The snow vanished, and green pushed through the brown. The fields turned to mud under the hooves of cattle. Flocks of blackbirds returned, their cries sharp and bright against the blue sky. Even the air seemed different, lighter somehow, carrying the smell of moss and smoke and the faint sweetness of sap from the maple trees. Elias's father worked from dawn until dusk, preparing the land for planting. The plow cut deep furrows into the soft earth, turning up stones that glistened in the sun. Elias followed, breaking clods with his hoe, feeling the soil crumble under his boots. It was hard work, the kind that left blisters and sore shoulders, but he didn't mind. There was something cleansing about it, something ancient and right. Yet even as he worked, his thoughts began to wander. Ever since the winter nights of storytelling, something had stirred inside him, a restlessness he couldn't name. It came when he stood at the edge of the fields and looked toward the distant hills, or when a traveler passed through town with tales of places beyond the mountains. The world beyond the valley was changing, he knew. Roads were being built. New towns rising. People moving westward in wagons that vanished into the horizon. He had heard of the Louisiana Purchase, that enormous stretch of land added to the young nation just a few years before. Enough land for every man to have his own kingdom, one traveler said at the tavern. Elias had overheard him while delivering grain. Forests, rivers, and prairies that go on forever. Those words lingered in Elias's mind like the echo of a bell. Forever. At night, when the fire burned low and the others had gone to sleep, he would sit by the window and stare into the dark. He imagined a world beyond the hills, wide plains where herds of bison moved like storm clouds, mountains sharp against the sky, rivers that shone silver under the moon. He wondered who lived there. He wondered if he would ever see it himself. But the thought made him uneasy, too. His father often spoke against foolish dreaming. "The land you have is the land you keep," he'd say. "Chasing what's far away only makes you forget what's under your feet." Thomas Carter's voice carried the authority of a man who had seen too much loss, of land, of people, of certainty. Still, the pull of the unknown grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just ambition, it was curiosity. The same quiet force that made Elias explore the woods as a child now tugged him toward something vaster. Sometimes, when he walked to town, he would pause by the old post road and watch the wagons go by. Traders, settlers, soldiers, peddlers. He studied their faces, weary, sunburned, determined. They were people in motion, chasing horizons that never seemed to end. "Where are they all going?" he asked once, to no one in particular. A man beside him, loading barrels into a cart, replied without looking up. "West. Always west. There's more world out there than anyone can imagine." That night, Elias dreamed of endless grasslands. In his dream, he stood alone under a sky so wide it made him dizzy. The wind moved through the tall grass like water, and somewhere far off, he thought he heard drums, faint, rhythmic, ancient. He woke with the sound still in his ears. The next morning, the valley was wrapped in mist. The trees dripped quietly, and the fields shimmered with dew. As he worked beside his father, Elias found himself glancing again and again toward the hills, the same ridge he had climbed as a boy. It seemed taller now, more mysterious, as if it hid something beyond. When he finally climbed it again that evening, the view struck him with new force. The whole valley lay below, the farms, the creek, the dark line of the forest. Smoke rose gently from the chimneys, curling into the pale sky. For the first time, Elias noticed how small it all looked. Beautiful, yes, but small. He sat there for a long while, watching the last light fade. In the distance, geese passed overhead in a long wavering V, calling to each other as they moved north. The sound was haunting, wild, free, untethered. He closed his eyes and imagined following them. When he returned home, the air smelled of supper, stew, bread, and something sweet cooling on the windowsill. His sister Lydia greeted him with her usual chatter, but his father watched him quietly. "You've been on the ridge again," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Elias hesitated, then nodded. "Your mother used to climb that hill too," his father said, his voice softer now. "Back when we were first married. She said she liked to see how far the world went." He paused, then added, "It goes far enough, son. But don't go losing yourself trying to find the end of it." Elias wanted to answer, to explain that he wasn't trying to escape, only to understand, but the words wouldn't come. So he just nodded again and sat down to eat. Later, as he lay in bed, he listened to the frogs beginning to sing by the creek. The first real song of spring. The night air was warmer now, full of the scent of damp earth and pine. He could hear the house settling, a soft creak here, a sigh there. But beneath all of it, that restlessness pulsed like a heartbeat. The world was waking up. And so was he. By early summer, the valley had turned green again, the kind of green that hums with life. The fields glowed in the sunlight, the air buzzed with insects, and the smell of grass and damp soil drifted everywhere. Elias worked hard with his father through the long hot days, but something had changed inside him. The world beyond the valley no longer felt distant. It was calling to him softly, like a song just out of reach. Once a week, he was sent into town with the wagon, to deliver flour, buy salt and nails, or pick up mail from the post office. The trip was 6 miles each way, along a dirt road that curved through the forest and followed the creek. It wasn't a difficult journey, but to Elias, it felt like a small adventure every time. The road itself had a personality. In spring, it smelled of mud and blossoms. In summer, of dust and pine. He could tell the time of day by how the sunlight filtered through the leaves, pale and golden in the morning, sharp and white at noon, then turning to honeyed amber as evening approached. Sometimes, deer crossed the road ahead of him, pausing just long enough to watch before vanishing into the trees. And always there were sounds: the squeak of the wagon's wooden wheels, the creak of leather harnesses, the rhythmic plod of the horses' hooves. Every turn of the road revealed something slightly different: a fallen tree, a new bird's nest, a patch of wildflowers bursting in color. When he reached town, the stillness of the valley gave way to movement and noise. The main street was lined with simple buildings: a tavern, a blacksmith's forge, a general store, a church, and a few houses clustered together like a family huddled against the wind. Chickens wandered freely, dogs barked at wagons, and the smell of smoke and bread and horse sweat filled the air. Elias loved it. Not for the bustle itself, but for the sense of life, of connection. People from miles around crossing paths for a few brief moments before scattering back to their farms. At the general store, he often lingered after finishing his errands. The storekeeper, Mr. Weller, was a kind man with a thick beard and a fondness for talking. He always had some new item to show: a tin lantern from Philadelphia, a printed pamphlet about the wonders of electricity, or a newspaper full of news from distant places. One afternoon, Elias stood by the counter, staring at a folded newspaper with the headline, "Explorers Reach the Pacific Ocean." The date read 1806, an article describing the return of the Lewis and Clark expedition. He read every word slowly, his eyes tracing the descriptions of endless plains, towering mountains, and unknown rivers that flowed through lands of untold beauty and promise. It was as if someone had written down the very dreams he'd been having all winter. Mr. Weller noticed. "Fine story, isn't it?" he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Imagine seeing all that with your own eyes." Elias nodded, his throat tight. "Do you think it's true? All of it?" The man smiled. "Oh, I reckon most of it. But even if half's true, it's more than enough to set a young man dreaming." As Elias left the store, the paper's words seemed to echo with every step. Untold beauty and promise. They clung to him all the way home, through the whispering forest and the hum of crickets rising with the evening air. At supper, he mentioned the article. His father didn't look up from his plate. "That's fine for them," Thomas said. "But a man's place is where his work is." His mother gave a quiet smile. "There's no harm in wondering, Tom." "Wondering's how a man loses his footing," his father replied, and that ended the talk. But later, after the candles were out, Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the faint creak of the old house and the distant sound of an owl. The words in the newspaper replayed in his mind: lands of untold beauty and promise. The phrase felt alive, glowing faintly in the dark like embers that refused to die. The following week he made the trip again, not because they needed supplies, but because he offered to help the blacksmith, Mr. Avery, shoe the horses. The older man was gruff but patient, and Elias learned quickly how to hold the hoof steady, how to hammer the iron, how to smell when the metal was just hot enough. In the evenings, Mr. Avery liked to sit on a barrel outside the forge, smoking his pipe and telling stories about the travelers who came through town. He had met fur trappers headed for the Great Lakes, soldiers marching toward the frontier forts, and peddlers with strange goods from cities Elias had only read about. One fellow, Avery said one night, puffing on his pipe, claimed he'd seen the Rocky Mountains. Said they went on forever, taller than clouds, cold as death, but beautiful as heaven. Elias listened, silent, the sparks from the forge glowing behind them like tiny stars. The world beyond the hills no longer felt imaginary. It was real, just far away, waiting. And yet, back in the valley, life went on unchanged. The crops grew, the creek ran clear, the evenings filled with the hum of frogs and crickets. Some nights Elias sat with his sister Lydia, helping her with her reading by candlelight. Other nights he walked down to the river and skipped stones until the last light vanished. But even in those quiet moments, the restlessness remained. It wasn't dissatisfaction, it was longing. He loved his home, his family, the smell of freshly turned earth after rain. But he felt there must be more to understand, something beyond the fields, beyond the ridge, beyond everything he'd ever known. One afternoon, as he passed through town again, he met a man who would linger in his memory for years. The stranger was sitting outside the tavern, his clothes dusty, his face tanned and weathered. He had the look of someone who had seen too much sun and too many roads. "You from around here, boy?" the man asked. Elias nodded. The stranger smiled faintly. "Then you don't know how big the world really is." When he spoke, Elias could almost see it, the endless grasslands, the smell of smoke on the wind, the sound of wolves far off in the dark. Before the man left, he said something Elias never forgot. "Out there," he said, pointing westward, "the land isn't quiet yet. It's still deciding what it wants to be. And the people who go there, they're deciding what they want to be too." That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He got up quietly, stepped outside, and stood barefoot in the cool grass. The moon was high, painting the fields silver. The air smelled of rain. He looked toward the ridge, where the world ended, or began, depending on how you saw it. The crickets sang, the creek whispered, and in that moment he understood something without words, that his life, like the land, was still deciding what it wanted to become. He didn't yet know when or how, but he knew one thing for certain: he would not stay in the valley forever. The road was calling, and soon he would answer. The summer of 1807 came warm and slow, and the valley seemed to breathe more deeply than ever before. The fields shimmered under the sun, the air was heavy with the scent of hay and wild mint, and the distant hills wavered in a haze of heat. Every day felt longer than the one before, and the evenings came with a golden calm that made the whole world seem half dreaming. Elias worked as he always had, plowing, mending fences, bringing in wood, tending to the cattle. Yet his hands moved on their own, while his mind wandered far away. He found himself staring westward more often now, past the line of trees that marked the horizon. It wasn't defiance or impatience, it was something quieter, deeper. A pull that came from somewhere he couldn't name. He tried to ignore it. He told himself that the life he had was enough: good land, good people, and peace. His father often said that was all any man should ever want. But sometimes at dusk, when the sky turned violet and the shadows grew long, he felt that peace was only another kind of waiting. The decision, though he didn't yet know it, began to take root one evening in July. That night, a storm was building in the distance. You could taste it before it came, the smell of iron and ozone in the air, the way the wind turned restless and cool. Elias stood outside by the barn, watching the sky flicker faintly with lightning. The clouds rolled like waves over the dark hills, and thunder rumbled far away, soft and slow. His father came out to help secure the shutters, his voice low and practical as always. "We'll get rain before midnight," he said. "Might flood down by the creek." They worked side by side for a while, tying the barn doors and covering the tools. The wind rose, carrying the first drops, large, cold, and deliberate. The fields darkened as the storm crept closer, until the valley was swallowed in silver rain. When they finished, Thomas leaned against the fence post, his face wet, his hat brim dripping. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then his father said quietly, "You've been thinking of leaving." The words hit harder than thunder. Elias turned, startled. "How?" "I've seen the way you look at the ridge," his father interrupted. "The way you listen when travelers pass through town. You've got that look, the same one I had once." He smiled faintly, almost sadly. "Difference is, I turned back." Rain pattered against the ground. The smell of wet earth rose around them, sharp and clean. Elias's voice was soft. "Why?" Thomas's gaze drifted toward the dark woods. "Because your mother was here. Because land doesn't plant itself. Because there's comfort in what's known. He paused, then added, but that doesn't mean I didn't wonder. Some nights I still do. The wind caught his coat, and for a while they just listened, to the rain, the distant thunder, the breathing of the land. Then his father said something Elias would remember for the rest of his life. If you go, he said, go with open eyes. Don't chase what you don't understand. The world's bigger than it looks from this valley, and it doesn't forgive the careless. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The storm passed, leaving behind a dripping quiet. He lay awake, listening to the slow drip of water from the eaves and the soft murmur of frogs in the flooded grass. He thought of his father's words, not as warning, but as permission. For the first time, he imagined truly leaving, walking the road past town, crossing the river, sleeping beneath unfamiliar stars. The idea no longer felt like a dream. It felt like something real, something waiting for him. In the morning, he woke early. The air was cool and washed clean, the sky still heavy with pale mist. He went down to the creek, where the water ran high and fast, carrying twigs and leaves in its current. He stood there for a long time, his boots sinking into the mud, watching the water rush toward somewhere unseen. That was how he wanted to move forward, even if he didn't know where the road would end. But there was one thing that held him back: his family. His mother's quiet smile, his sister's laughter, his father's silent strength. The thought of leaving them behind made his chest ache. And yet, the ache of staying felt even deeper. As summer turned to early autumn, he grew quieter. He took longer walks alone, stayed out late by the ridge, and listened to the world as if it were speaking a language only he could hear. He began keeping small notes, scraps of paper filled with sketches of hills, lists of what he might need if he ever did go: flint, knife, blanket, bread, compass. One evening, as the air turned cool again, he brought in wood from the yard and found his mother sitting by the fire, darning a sleeve. The light from the hearth flickered on her face, soft and warm. She looked up and studied him for a moment. "You've been far away lately," she said gently. He smiled faintly. "Not far. Just thinking." "About leaving?" He froze. Her tone wasn't accusing, only knowing, like someone who had seen the shape of a thought long before it was spoken. "I suppose," he said quietly. "Maybe someday." Mary Carter nodded slowly, threading her needle. "Someday comes faster than you think." She set the fabric down and looked into the fire. "Your father won't say it, but he understands. We both do. We came here for the same reason you want to leave, to find something of our own. The world changes, Elias. It always has." He didn't answer. He only watched her hands as she worked, the steady rhythm of the needle moving through cloth. That night, as the crickets sang and the fire faded to embers, Elias made his decision. He would go. Not tomorrow, not recklessly, but soon. He would wait until the harvest was done, until the fields were stored and the tools put away. Then, when the leaves began to fall, he would take the road westward and see what lay beyond the edge of his world. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't escape. It was simply time. When he finally slept, his dreams were filled with open roads, rivers shining under starlight, and mountains that seemed to breathe like sleeping giants. The land was calling, and now, at last, he was ready to listen. The first chill of autumn came almost without notice. One morning, Elias awoke to find the world hushed beneath a fine silver mist. The fields that only weeks ago shimmered with summer's heat now stood pale and waiting. The stalks of corn bent low, the hay stored, the smell of smoke drifting from every chimney in the valley. He had spent the last days of harvest in silence, working until his hands bled, trying to memorize every small thing: the creak of the barn door, the shape of the oak tree by the fence, the hum of his mother's song in the kitchen. He didn't speak of his plan aloud again. not even when his father handed him the axe each morning without a word, as if they both knew something had already been decided. The night before he was to leave, the air was heavy with the scent of apples and damp leaves. His mother baked a pie, perhaps out of habit, perhaps because she knew that certain comforts belonged to goodbyes. The fire crackled in the hearth, and their small house seemed to glow from within, a lantern against the dark. No one said the words, but the silence between them was full of everything unspoken. After supper, Elias went outside alone. The moon hung low, pale and steady, and the frost glimmered faintly on the grass. He walked down to the creek, the same one where he had stood months ago, imagining the road beyond. The water ran cold now, darker and faster, carrying the last leaves of summer toward the unseen distance. He crouched and touched the water's surface with his fingertips. It stung with cold, but it steadied him. That same current, he thought, might pass through lands he'd never seen, might join rivers that wound through endless plains, might touch the same faraway ocean that filled his dreams. When he returned to the house, his father was waiting by the door. In his hands was a small worn satchel, leather-faded and patched, the kind used by travelers long before Elias was born. "This was mine," Thomas said simply. "Take it." Elias ran his fingers across the rough leather. "I can't." "You can," his father said, his voice quiet but firm. "You'll need something to carry what matters. Don't pack too much. The road teaches you what you can live without." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire behind them flickered on the walls, making the shadows dance. Then his father added, almost as if to himself, "Every man has his own road. Just remember where yours began." They clasped hands, not the light kind, but the heavy wordless grip that says all there is to say. That night, Elias barely slept. The crickets sang their last songs of the season, and the air grew colder with each passing hour. When he did drift into sleep, it was shallow, filled with the faint sound of wind in the trees and the echo of hooves on some faraway road. By dawn, he was awake. He rose quietly, not to wake anyone, but when he came downstairs, he found his mother already in the kitchen. She had lit the lamp and stood by the window, hands clasped before her. "I thought I'd see you off," she said softly. He nodded, unable to speak. On the table, she had laid a small bundle of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a folded piece of cloth. Inside the cloth were a few coins, not much, but more than she could spare. "Don't worry about us," she said gently, pressing the bundle into his hands. "The house will be here when you return. Just promise me you'll come back someday, even if only to tell us what you've seen." Elias tried to answer, but his throat closed. He managed only a quiet, "I will." Outside, the first light of dawn touched the hills, and mist drifted low over the fields. The world seemed still, waiting for something to begin. His father appeared at the doorway, his face unreadable in the gray light. His sister, little Ruth, peeked out from behind him, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She ran forward and threw her arms around Elias's waist. "You'll write," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "If I can find paper and a place to send it from." Then she stepped back, and there was nothing left to do but go. Elias shouldered the satchel, adjusted the strap, and turned to face the road. It ran westward, winding between the hills until it vanished into the mist. He hesitated once, looking back, at the fields, the barn, the faint smoke curling from the chimney. His father raised one hand, just slightly, and that was enough. Then Elias took his first step. The sound of gravel under his boots felt strange, too loud in the quiet morning. With each step, the house grew smaller, the world larger. The road curved down past the ridge, where the view opened wide. Forests like dark seas, rivers like silver threads, and far away, mountains rising like a promise. He walked until the sun rose fully, burning away the mist. The light spilled over the land, golden and alive, and for the first time he felt the weight of freedom, not the bright kind, but the heavy, uncertain kind that fills you with both hope and fear. That afternoon, he passed the small town where he'd traded grain as a boy. The blacksmith called to him, the innkeeper nodded, and old Mrs. Harlan pressed a small charm into his hand, a copper coin with a hole in the center. "For luck," she said, "and for finding your way back if you get lost." By nightfall, he had walked farther than he ever had in his life. The road narrowed, the forest closed in, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. When the stars came out, he built his first fire alone, small, careful, flickering against the dark. He ate bread and cheese, listened to the whisper of the woods, and thought about home. But he didn't look back. Not tonight. In the distance, he could hear the faint cry of an owl, and beneath it, the steady murmur of the wind moving through unseen valleys. He felt something stir inside him, not loneliness, not fear, but a strange, growing wonder. The world was vast. And now, at last, it belonged to him. For the first few days, Elias felt like a man walking inside a dream. The road stretched on endlessly, winding through the low hills, past fields long harvested and streams that whispered in the underbrush. The world around him seemed both vast and close, every tree, every stone sharp in the clean air, yet beyond them lay a silence so deep it felt alive. At dawn, mist rose from the valleys like smoke, drifting through the branches of oaks and maples just beginning to turn. The colors of the world changed daily, first green, then rust, then a deep crimson that glowed like embers in the light. It was as if the land itself was burning slowly into winter. Elias walked until his legs ached, stopping only when the sun dropped low behind the hills. Some nights he found barns to sleep in, trading a few hours of labor for shelter. Other nights he camped beside the road, his fire a lonely flicker in the great dark. He began to grow used to the company of his own thoughts, to the way silence could become a kind of voice. The first traveler he met was an old man with a mule cart, carrying barrels of cider toward the next town. The man's beard was gray and wild, his hat weathered, his eyes bright as glass. "Heading west, are you?" the man asked, his voice half lost in the creak of the wheels. Elias nodded. "That's the plan." The old man smiled, showing the gap in his teeth. "Everyone's heading west these days. Folks think the land's gentler out there. But the land's the same everywhere. It just looks different when you're still full of hope." They walked together for half a day, sharing bread and stories. The man had come from Pennsylvania, once worked a forge, and claimed to have seen a ghost along the Susquehanna River, a soldier from the war that had ended before Elias was born. "They say he walks the riverbank," the man said, tapping the side of his nose, looking for a letter he never got to send. Elias didn't know whether to laugh or shiver. The story stayed with him long after the man turned off toward a village hidden in the trees. It was his first taste of what travelers carried besides goods. They carried stories, rumors, the living breath of a country still inventing itself. By the fifth day, the weather shifted. Cold winds swept down from the north, and the sky took on a hard, bright blue. The forests thinned into stretches of open plain, and he began to see cabins spaced miles apart, smoke curling from their chimneys like thin signals in the wilderness. One evening, near sundown, Elias reached a small tavern by the crossroads, a wooden building leaning slightly to one side, its sign swinging in the wind, "The Pilgrim's Rest." Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke, stew, and pipe tobacco. Men sat around the fire, boots muddy, faces red from drink and wind. A fiddler played in the corner, and someone laughed loud enough to shake the rafters. Elias found a seat near the back and ordered a bowl of soup. He didn't plan to talk, but talk found him. A trapper sat beside him, a man with a fur hat, his face tanned and lined. "You've got that look," the trapper said, studying him. "First time west." Elias nodded. The man grinned. "You'll see things out there that'll make you question whether the world's ever been civilized. Forests that go on for days. Wolves that follow you just out of sight. And rivers so wide, you could lose the sun in them." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "They say there are men living in the hills who haven't spoken to another soul in 20 years. And tribes who no paths no map ever caught." Elias listened, the words sinking into him like seeds. The trapper's tone wasn't one of fear, it was reverence. The wild, to him, wasn't danger. It was truth. Later, when the fire had burned low and the tavern began to empty, Elias stepped outside. The night was clear, stars scattered thick across the sky. The road gleamed faintly under the moonlight, stretching west, endless, silent, waiting. He thought of home again, just for a moment. The sound of the river, the warmth of the hearth, his mother's soft voice. Then he breathed in the cold air, felt it fill his chest, and began walking once more. 4 days after, he met few people. The towns grew smaller, farther apart. He crossed wooden bridges that creaked beneath him, passed wagons drawn by oxen, and sometimes walked entire afternoons without seeing another living soul. The loneliness was strange, not painful but vast, like the open sky. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, Elias came upon a field of abandoned cabins, empty shells of homes, their doors swinging, roofs caved in. He stepped through one, finding the remains of a hearth and a rusted kettle half buried in dust. It felt like walking through a memory that didn't belong to him. He sat for a while, watching the last light fade through the cracks in the walls. Somewhere beyond the tree-line, an owl called, slow and mournful. He wondered who had lived there, what had driven them away. Famine, sickness, the pull of another horizon? Perhaps their ghosts still wandered nearby, searching for something they'd left behind. That night, he dreamed of voices whispering through the trees, not frightening but familiar, as if the land itself were trying to tell him its history. He woke before dawn, heart steady, breath fogging in the chill air. Each step after that felt different. The road no longer seemed to lead away from home, but deeper into something vast and ancient, the quiet soul of a country still becoming itself. By the 10th day, the hills opened into wide plains. The air smelled of grass and far-off rain, and the horizon seemed to go on forever. Elias stood there for a long time, watching the wind ripple through the tall stalks like waves on a sea of green. He thought of the old man's words, "The land's the same everywhere," and wondered if maybe that was true. But it didn't feel the same. Here, the silence had weight. The air carried promise. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. And as the wind swept across the plains, it sounded almost like a voice, low, endless, and kind, whispering, "Keep going." It was on the 12th day of his journey that Elias first saw the great river. He had been walking since dawn through a land that seemed carved by the wind. Low ridges and endless grasses, the occasional cottonwood marking where a stream might run. The sky was pale and high, a white-blue vault that felt both holy and indifferent. By midday he began to hear it, a low, constant murmur, faint at first but growing louder with every step. When he reached the crest of a hill, the world opened wide before him. There it was, the river. Broad, gray, alive. It wound through the valley like a sleeping serpent, its surface shifting and glinting in the sun. On the far side, the land rose again, greener, wilder, unknown. He stopped and stared, heart steady but breath caught in his chest. The river wasn't just water. It was a border, a test, a line between what he had been and whatever waited beyond. Down near the bank, smoke curled from a small campfire. A wagon stood nearby, its wheels half buried in mud, and beside it, 2 figures were working with a rope and pole, a man and a woman, both rough-looking but steady-handed. Their horses drank from the shallows, steam rising from their flanks. Elias approached slowly, calling out a greeting. The man turned, tall, lean, his beard streaked with gray. He wore a hat pulled low and had the calm eyes of someone who'd seen more road than most. The woman, younger, glanced up from the water with a nod. "Morning," the man said. "You looking to cross?" Elias nodded. "If it's possible." The man looked at the river, then back at him. "It's always possible," he said. "Question is whether it's worth what it costs." He introduced himself as Jonah Pike, a former carpenter from Maryland, now traveling with his wife, Clara. They'd been on the road for weeks, heading toward the new settlements near the Ohio Territory. Their wagon carried all they owned, tools, food, and what little they could trade. "The current's strong," Jonah said, glancing at the water. "Too deep to ford without help. We're building a raft. Slow work, but it'll hold if the Lord's willing." Elias offered to help, and the man accepted with a nod. Together they worked through the afternoon, cutting branches, tying them with rope, and stacking logs into a floating platform. Clara boiled coffee over the fire, and the smell filled the cool air. They spoke little at first. Each word seemed to vanish into the sound of the water. But soon, the rhythm of labor broke the silence. Jonah told stories as they worked, of the years he'd spent building homes that now stood empty, of friends who'd gone west and never returned, of the way the land seemed to swallow men whole and forget their names. Clara, quiet but sharp-eyed, listened without interrupting. She was not fragile, Elias noticed. Her hands were rough from work, her hair tied back, her gaze steady. She spoke once, near evening, when the raft was nearly done. "Every road takes something from you," she said softly. "Sometimes it's a thing you can see. Sometimes it's something you didn't know you had." Elias didn't ask what the road had taken from her. He could see it in her eyes, that deep, tired calm of someone who had already lost and learned to keep walking anyway. By nightfall, the raft was ready. The river glowed faintly in the moonlight, silver and endless. The three of them sat by the fire, sharing the last of the bread and a tin of beans. The air smelled of wet wood and smoke. Jonah drew a crude map in the dirt with a stick, showing the road beyond the river, a faint trail that led toward the frontier towns where land was cheap and rules were few. "You follow this road long enough," he said, "and you'll reach the kind of country where a man can live or die on his own terms." Elias stared into the fire. "Is that what you're looking for?" Jonah smiled faintly. "No. I'm looking for somewhere my wife can stop running." Clara didn't respond, but her gaze softened as she stared into the flames. The wind carried the smell of water and the whisper of shifting reeds. They crossed at dawn. The river was colder than Elias expected, a living thing, pulling and pushing with invisible strength. They loaded the wagon onto the raft, tied the horses alongside, and pushed off. The current caught them immediately, spinning the raft sideways before Jonah and Elias dug their poles into the mud, fighting to steer. The sound was enormous, the rush of water, the creak of logs, the low grunt of horses straining against the pull. For a moment, Elias thought they'd be swept away. His boots slipped, and cold spray hit his face. "Hold steady," Jonah shouted. "Don't fight it, guide it." They angled the raft, letting the current carry them diagonally toward the far shore. The journey across took minutes, but it felt like hours. When the raft struck the opposite bank, it hit hard, sending up a spray of mud and river water. They had made it. For a moment, none of them spoke. They stood on the new shore, dripping and breathless, watching the water move on without them. Then Jonah laughed, a deep, weary laugh that turned quickly into a cough. "Well," he said, catching his breath, "that's one river behind us. Only 100 more to go." They spent the rest of the morning drying their clothes and repairing the wagon. The land on this side of the river felt different, wilder, less settled. The trees grew thicker, the birds louder, the air sharper. When it was time to move on, Jonah and Clara offered Elias a place to travel with them. For a while, Jonah said. Roads safer with company. Elias agreed, and together they began the long climb westward. By evening, they reached a ridge overlooking miles of untouched forest. The sky blazed orange, and the river they had crossed shone like a ribbon of light far behind them. Elias stood there, staring back at it, realizing how far he'd already come, and how far there still was to go. The wind rose, whispering through the trees. For the first time, he felt not like a boy leaving home, but like a traveler moving through history itself, part of something vast, harsh, and beautiful. The forest west of the river seemed endless. For 3 days, Elias walked beside Jonah and Clara through a world that smelled of pine and rain-soaked soil. The path wound between towering trunks and silent glades where sunlight dripped in golden threads. Sometimes they saw deer watching from the brush, still and weightless, like spirits in the undergrowth. Other times, they heard wolves at night, distant and low, their voices rolling through the dark like the echo of the land itself. The air grew colder with each passing day. Autumn was fading fast, and winter was already whispering from the mountains ahead. Still, there was comfort in company. The rhythm of footsteps, the quiet murmur of voices, the small fire each night that pushed back the endless dark. They set camp one evening in a clearing surrounded by birch trees. The leaves had all fallen, carpeting the ground in pale gold that glowed faintly in the firelight. The wagon stood nearby, its wheels half buried in leaves. The horses grazed quietly under the trees, their breath visible in the chill. Jonah built the fire while Clara cooked, salted pork, beans, and the last of their coffee. Elias sat nearby, watching sparks twist up into the night, vanishing into the black. The stars here seemed different, closer, brighter, more alive. For a while, no one spoke. There was only the sound of the crackling wood, the softness of the pot, the faraway rush of a river unseen. Then Jonah leaned back against a log and said, "You ever notice how the woods get louder when you try to listen to them?" Elias smiled faintly. "I have." Jonah nodded. "That's how you know you've left the world of men behind. Back east, noise comes from what we build. Wagons, hammers, church bells. Out here, noise comes from what was here before us." He poked at the fire. "And it don't care much whether we're listening." Clara handed Elias a tin bowl of stew. "He means the wilderness talks," she said softly. "You just have to decide whether to answer." The way she said it made Elias glance at her. Her voice held no superstition, just quiet certainty. "Have you ever answered it?" he asked. She didn't look up from the fire. "Once," she said. "Didn't like what it said." Jonah gave a short laugh, but it wasn't entirely amused. "We lost our boy," he said after a moment. 2 winters back. Fever took him quick. Buried him near the ridge above the Monongahela. After that, Clara said the woods started whispering at night. Elias felt the air change, the kind of stillness that comes when grief walks through a room. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, the firelight flickering in his eyes. Clara's gaze drifted into the dark. "Sometimes," she said, "when the wind moves just right, I swear I hear him calling. Not words, just his voice. Like the forest remembers him." The 3 of them sat in silence after that. The fire popped. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted, long, hollow, mournful. Later, when the stars were high, Jonah began to tell stories, not of ghosts this time, but of the frontier itself. He spoke of travelers who vanished into the forests and were never seen again. Of men who found gold in a riverbed and went mad guarding it. Of a preacher who claimed he'd seen angels walking in the mist, their faces hidden by veils of rain. Elias listened, entranced. The stories didn't feel like entertainment. They felt like pieces of a larger truth, the way the early world spoke through those who dared to wander it. When the fire burned low, Jonah fetched a jug of cider from the wagon. They drank quietly, passing it between them. The warmth of it spread slow and steady through Elias's chest. "You know," Jonah said, "most folks think the wilderness is something to be conquered. Cut it, tame it, build over it. But the older I get, the more I think it's the other way around. It conquers us. It just takes its time." He looked up at the trees. "That's why I build fires big, not to keep warm, but to remind myself where I end and the dark begins." Elias nodded. The words settled deep inside him. He looked at the forest, vast, silent, breathing, and for the first time he felt the faint edge of fear. Not of beasts or bandits, but of the endlessness itself. As the fire died, Clara spread a blanket over her shoulders and looked toward the horizon. "Tomorrow we reach the plains," she murmured. "Past that, there's no turning back." Elias lay awake long after they had fallen asleep. The stars shimmered through the branches like eyes, and the wind shifted softly through the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard a voice, faint, almost human, carried on the air. He sat up, listening. It came again, a whisper, then silence. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe not. He remembered Clara's words, the wilderness talks. You just have to decide whether to answer. Slowly, he lay back down, his heart steady but awake. He didn't answer, not yet. But he felt something had heard him anyway. By dawn, the fire was cold, the mist thick. The travelers packed in silence, their breath pale in the air. As they broke camp, Jonah looked westward and said quietly, "Everything changes beyond those trees. You'll see." They stepped back onto the road, the wagon creaking, the horses snorting in the cold. The forest thinned and ahead, the land opened wide again, not gentle this time, but vast and waiting. Elias looked over his shoulder one last time. The clearing was already vanishing behind the mist, as if the forest were swallowing the memory of their fire. Then he turned forward. The road continued, pale and rough, vanishing into the horizon like a thread pulled through the world. He didn't know where it led, only that it was still calling. The trees ended so suddenly that it almost felt like stepping off the edge of the world. One moment, Elias and the travelers walked beneath the close shadows of the birch forest, the air cool, filled with the smell of damp bark and moss. The next, the world opened wide in front of them, and the light struck like a revelation. The forest gave way to grassland that rolled endlessly to the horizon, a vast sea of gold and green, shimmering beneath the late autumn sun. Elias stopped for a long moment, just staring. After weeks beneath the trees, the sky itself felt enormous, too wide, too blue, almost terrifying in its emptiness. The wind swept through the grass with a sound like waves on a hidden ocean. Jonah grinned as he followed Elias's gaze. "Welcome to the plains," he said. "Nothing between here and the mountains but wind and stubbornness." Clara shaded her eyes and looked west. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, "but it feels like it's watching." Elias felt the same. There was something alive about the land, not in the way forests breathed or rivers moved, but in its sheer stillness. It was as though the earth itself was holding its breath. They followed the wagon trail across the plain, the road a pale scar in the grass. The wheels creaked, the horses' hooves made soft, rhythmic sounds, and the horizon never seemed to come closer. Days passed like that, endless walking, endless wind. Sometimes they saw herds of bison far away, dark shapes moving like storm clouds across the grass. Once they passed an abandoned homestead, a few rotted posts, the remains of a cabin, a well filled with sand. Jonah spat and muttered, "Another soul the land swallowed whole." At night, the stars returned, clearer now than ever before. There were so many that Elias could hardly bear to look at them all at once. It felt as though they'd stepped back in time to the first days of the world. The air grew drier, the nights colder. Their provisions were running low. Clara rationed the flour carefully, baking flatbread over the fire each morning, while Jonah checked the wagon's wheels and tightened the harness straps. Elias helped where he could, though his hands were still not the callous tools of a frontiersman. He'd been a teacher once, back east. Now he was a wanderer, chasing a future that seemed to vanish whenever he drew near. One evening, as the sun sank like a burning coin behind the edge of the land, they saw something strange, a flicker of smoke far to the north. Another camp? Elias asked. Jonah squinted. Could be. Or lightning strike. Hard to tell at this distance. But as night fell, the smoke became a glow, steady low orange. Not wild enough for a fire, not bright enough for a town. Clara frowned. Someone's out there. They decided to camp nearby, wary but curious. That night, the wind carried sounds, faint drumming voices, laughter. Elias couldn't tell whether it was human or just the land playing tricks again. Jonah stayed awake, rifle across his knees. Used to be whole nations out here, he said quietly. Osage, Pawnee, Sioux. They moved like shadows, gone before you even saw them. But sometimes you still hear 'em. Ghost fires, some say. Elias didn't sleep much. He lay staring at the tent's canvas, listening to the endless hum of wind. Every so often, he thought he heard something beyond it, a rhythm, soft and steady, like distant hoofbeats. In the morning, the glow was gone, and the plains stretched empty again. They continued west, and the weather began to turn. A hard wind blew from the north, sharp with the promise of winter. Dust rose from the road, covering their faces and clothes until everything, skin, wagon, horses, turned the same pale, weary color as the land. By the fifth day, they reached a shallow river winding through the grass. It was low, half-frozen at the edges, but it sparkled under the weak sun. They stopped to rest, refilled their barrels, and let the horses drink. Elias sat by the water, watching it move. There was something comforting about its persistence, a reminder that even out here, in all this emptiness, the world still flowed. Jonah joined him, squatting down beside the bank. You ever think about what drives folks to come this far? He asked. Elias nodded slowly. I think about it all the time. Jonah chuckled. Some say it's gold. Others say land. But I think it's something simpler, the idea that if you just keep walking, you'll outrun yourself. He threw a pebble into the stream. Never works, though. You always catch up, one way or another. Elias thought of the firelight back east, the streets he'd left behind, the letters he never answered. Jonah was right. He hadn't left those things behind. He just carried them across a different kind of landscape. That night, they made camp by the river. The stars were dimmer, clouds moving in from the north. The wind had a strange sound to it, a hollow tone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Clara cooked in silence, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Feels like a storm's coming, she said softly. Jonah nodded. Aye. And out here, storms don't knock before they come in. By midnight, the wind rose to a roar. The fire struggled, sparks spinning like fireflies in the dark. The grass bent flat beneath the gusts, the wagon shuddered, and the horses stamped restlessly. Elias wrapped his blanket tighter and watched as lightning flickered across the far horizon. Silent flashes that lit the land in ghostly white for an instant, then vanished into black. There was no thunder, only wind. Endless, whistling wind. By dawn, the storm had passed. The air smelled of rain and iron. The plains were quiet again, washed clean. Jonah stretched his back and said, "That's the thing about this country. It gives and it takes without a word of warning. Elias nodded, looking at the washed horizon. Do you think anyone will ever tame it? Jonah laughed, not kindly. No one tames a sea boy. They just learn how not to drown in it. And for the first time, Elias understood. The plains were not empty, they were full. Full of memory, silence, distance, and time. He looked west, where the land curved toward the mountains. Faint shapes waiting like the next chapter of a story too vast to ever finish. The road went on, and so did they. The morning after the storm felt hollow, as if the world had been emptied and wrung dry. The sky was the color of cold iron. The grass lay flattened in rippling patterns, glistening with dew, and the wagon's wheels were caked with mud. The air smelled of wet dust and ozone, the scent of something burned away, though no fire had touched the land. Elias helped Jonah repair a loose strap while Clara packed the remains of their camp. The silence between them was easy, but it felt different, heavier somehow, as though the storm had shaken something awake inside the land itself. By mid-morning, they were on the move again. The trail was softer now, the horses straining against the mud. The sun broke through once, a thin pale disk behind drifting clouds, before disappearing again. They traveled in quiet. Even Jonah, who usually filled the silence with old frontier tales or sharp bits of humor, said little. The wind was too restless, shifting directions without warning. It was late afternoon when they saw him. A lone figure, far ahead on the trail, moving slowly, hunched in the saddle, his horse limping. At first, he looked like a trick of distance, a shimmer of movement on the horizon. But as they drew closer, Elias could see him clearly. A man in a wide-brimmed hat, coat torn at the shoulder, face hidden beneath a scarf dark with dust. Jonah slowed the wagon. "You see that?" he muttered. Clara nodded, shading her eyes. "He's hurt." They approached carefully. The man didn't seem to notice them at first. His horse stopped, lowering its head as if exhausted. Then the stranger turned, slowly, and raised a gloved hand. "Afternoon," Jonah called out, keeping his rifle close but not lifted. The man nodded faintly. His voice, when it came, was rough, like gravel and smoke. "Afternoon. Storm took me off my path. Lost my pack horse. Haven't seen another soul in 2 days." Jonah eyed him carefully. "You heading west?" The stranger nodded again. "Was, till the river flooded. Thought I'd circle south." Clara climbed down from the wagon. "You look half-starved. We've stew and bread if you'll sit a while." The man hesitated, then dismounted with slow, stiff movements. He was tall though lean, and his clothes were travel-worn, not the garb of a settler, but of someone who'd been living on the edge of civilization for too long. A small pistol hung at his belt, polished but old. As he drew near the fire, Elias caught a glimpse of his eyes, gray, steady, unreadable. The kind of eyes that had seen too many horizons. He gave his name as Mason. No last name, and none offered. He ate quietly, every movement careful, deliberate. For a long while, no one spoke. The sound of wind over the grass filled the silence. Then Jonah asked, "You come from back east?" "Farther," Mason said. "Started near the Mississippi. Worked along the riverboats till the war. Been drifting since." Elias looked up. "Which war?" Mason smiled faintly. "The one everyone pretends ended, but never really did." Something in his tone made Elias uneasy. There was no bitterness in it, just a quiet weariness, like someone describing an illness that never healed. After they finished eating, Mason took a small pouch from his coat and rolled a cigarette. He lit it with a spark from the fire, the smoke curling blue in the cold air. "You folks heading to the mountains?" he asked. Jonah nodded. trying to reach the foothills before winter sets in. Heard there's good land near the Sweetwater River. Mason exhaled slowly. There's land, sure. Good land, if you can hold it. But the wind out there's meaner than it looks. And sometimes, he added softly, you hear voices when you shouldn't. Clara gave him a sharp glance. Voices. He shrugged. Could be the wind. Could be the old world talking. Depends on who's listening. The words lingered. Elias felt again that strange sense from the night before, that the land itself was aware of them, watching from every direction at once. When the sun began to sink, Mason offered to ride with them for a while. Safer in numbers, he said simply. Jonah agreed. One more set of eyes can't hurt. They moved on together, the wagon creaking behind, Mason's horse limping beside. He spoke little, though sometimes he hummed under his breath, low tunes without words that seemed older than any hymn Elias had heard. That night, they made camp by a cluster of low rocks, the first shelter they'd seen in days. The wind had quieted, and the sky was full of stars again, sharp, endless. As they sat around the fire, Mason began to speak. Not about himself, but about the land. Long before any of us came out here, he said, the people who lived on these plains believed they were alive. The rivers, the hills, even the storms. Said when you walked far enough west, you'd find the place where the earth was born, where the wind first learned how to move. Elias leaned closer. And have you seen it? Mason smiled faintly. Maybe. Maybe I just dreamed it. Hard to tell out here. Dreams and memories get tangled. The firelight flickered across his face, lined, sunburned, unreadable. For a moment, he looked ancient, like one of those travelers in the old stories who never seemed to belong to any particular time. When the fire burned low, Mason rose to his feet. I'll take the first watch, he said. Don't rest easy in new company. Jonah nodded. Suit yourself. Elias lay down beside the wagon, but sleep came slow. Through half-closed eyes, he watched Mason's silhouette, motionless against the stars, coat whipping in the wind. Sometime deep in the night, Elias woke to a sound, not a word, not quite. A tone, long and low, drifting across the plain. It could have been the wind. But it carried rhythm, almost like a song. Mason was gone from his post. Elias sat up, heart quickening. The fire had burned to embers. The others were asleep. He listened. The sound came again, faint, then vanished. He sat by the dying fire, eyes fixed on the horizon until dawn. When the morning came, the air felt colder. Mason said little. They packed and moved on, the trail stretching endlessly ahead. But Elias couldn't shake the thought, that sound in the night, the rhythm that had no words. And somewhere deep inside, he began to wonder if the storm had left something behind. Something that now followed just beyond sight. The days that followed blurred into one another, long hours of motion beneath a pale, sunless sky. The plains were endless, shifting colors with the wind. Gold in the morning, gray by noon, the color of smoke by dusk. Sometimes the horizon seemed to move, as if the land itself were breathing. Mason rode a few paces ahead now, silent as ever. Jonah and Clara spoke less than before, too, as though something in the air pressed the words back down their throats. Only the wind talked, whispering through the grass in a language Elias couldn't understand. One morning, as they moved westward, Clara stopped the wagon and tilted her head. "You hear that?" she asked. Elias strained his ears. At first, there was only wind, the soft rush that never really stopped. But then, underneath it, came something else. A rhythm. Faint, scattered, like distant footsteps. "Maybe buffalo," Jonah said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. No herd moves that slow, Mason murmured. They stood listening for a long time. The sound faded, replaced again by the restless murmur of the grass. Still, the unease remained. That evening, they camped near a line of shallow hills, the first rise in the land they'd seen in days. The wind came from the east now, bringing the smell of rain and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron. As the fire burned low, Mason finally spoke. "You ever hear of the listening plains?" he asked, his voice barely louder than the crackle of the fire. Elias shook his head. "No. What's that?" Mason's eyes stayed on the horizon. The old ones used to say this part of the country could hear. Said the land remembered every voice, every step, every word ever spoken on it. And sometimes, when the wind's right, it gives them back. Jonah grunted. "You mean echoes?" Mason didn't answer right away. Then softly, "Maybe." Clara looked up from the pot she was stirring. "And if it isn't just echoes?" Mason glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Then it's history talking. The kind that never dies." They ate in silence after that. The firelight wavered against the low hills, making them seem to shift, to breathe. Somewhere in the darkness, something moved. Not close, but not far either. The horses snorted and stamped, their eyes catching the faint light. Elias didn't sleep much. The tent flapped in the wind, whispering like cloth trying to speak. He dreamed of voices, hundreds of them, rising and falling with the sound of the grass. He woke more than once, sure someone had spoken his name just outside. At dawn, the plains were covered in fog. The wagon wheels vanished beneath the mist as they moved forward, the world reduced to a pale blur. Mason led them slowly, his shape half swallowed by the whiteness. Around midday, the fog lifted suddenly, revealing something that made them all stop. In the middle of the plain stood a ring of stones, tall, smooth, weathered by centuries. They formed a perfect circle, maybe 20 feet across. No trees, no markings, no sign of who or what had placed them there. Jonah whistled low. "Now what do you make of that?" Mason dismounted. "Seen a few of these before. Nobody knows who built them. Some say the old tribes used them for councils. Others say they were there before any people came at all." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Before people." Mason nodded. "The stories say this land had its own memory long before men gave it names." Elias walked closer to the stones. They were cool to the touch, smooth as glass. For a moment, he thought he could hear something faint, a hum, like air vibrating deep inside the earth. When he stepped back, the sound stopped. "Let's move on," Jonah said, unease in his tone. "No good comes from standing where we're not invited." They pushed west again, but the mood had changed. The plains no longer felt open, they felt watchful. That night, the wind rose again, not fierce, just insistent. It slid over the grass like a whisper passed from one blade to another. As Elias lay beneath the wagon, he thought he heard it form words, though none he could understand. Just fragments, like memory trying to speak. At one point, Mason approached the dying fire, threw in a stick, and murmured, "They're louder tonight." Elias turned. "The voices." Mason didn't look at him. Not voices. More like the sound of something remembering. He sat down beside the flames, hands outstretched to the warmth. Every man who's ever crossed this land left a piece of himself in it. His breath, his fear, his hope. The plains don't forget that. Not ever. Jonah stirred, half asleep. "That's just talk," he muttered. "Wind don't carry souls." Mason smiled faintly. "No, but it carries the sound of them." Later, long after the others had drifted to sleep, Elias woke again. The night was utterly still. No wind, no fire crackle, just silence so deep it felt like pressure. Then, faintly, from somewhere out in the dark, he heard singing. It was distant, a low rhythmic chant, words too old to understand. For a moment, he thought it must be a dream, but the horses shifted nervously, ears twitching toward the sound. Elias crept out, his boots sinking into the cold grass. The sky above was full of stars, vast, indifferent, endless. The singing stopped. And in that silence, something else came, a whisper that wasn't a word, just a breath close to his ear. He turned, heart pounding. Nothing. Just the field, shimmering in the starlight. He went back to the wagon and lay awake until dawn. When he finally slept, he dreamed of the stone circle, standing alone under a sky without sun, humming softly like the heartbeat of the earth. When morning came, Mason said only one thing before they set out. "The plains are listening," he murmured. "Best to keep your thoughts kind." Elias didn't argue. The wind had returned, and somehow, it sounded like it agreed. By the time the century began to draw to its close, our small American town had changed in ways that would have seemed like wizardry to those who had first raised its wooden houses. I was an old man by then, with lines on my hands that told a story of fields, storms, laughter, and loss. The children who once followed wagons of wheat now hurried along the dusty main street with newspapers tucked under their arms, shouting headlines about the new century. Electric wires hummed above their heads, like cobwebs of lightning strung between the rooftops. The night no longer belonged entirely to the stars. Lamps glowed in windows even past sundown. The darkness that had once gathered around the town like a heavy blanket was thinner now, tamed by the quiet flicker of electricity. The blacksmith's shop had fallen silent. The clang of the hammer no longer rang through the air. He had turned his forge into a small repair shop for bicycles and sewing machines, new inventions that fascinated everyone. Horses still walked the streets, but you could see in people's eyes a sense that something else was coming, something faster and louder. They whispered of automobiles, machines that could move without a horse at all. I remember standing by the post office when a traveling salesman arrived in one, rumbling, coughing, and hissing as if possessed. The crowd gathered, some laughing, some frightened. The old pastor said it was a sign that men were trying to outrun their own souls. In those years, the town grew busier but not always kinder. The railroad brought goods and strangers, and with them came stories, some bright, some dark. There were tales of fortunes made overnight and others of dreams ruined in the mines and mills. A few men went west to seek gold and never returned. Their names were spoken softly by the fire, like half-forgotten prayers. The women who stayed behind found work in textile shops, their days ruled by the hiss of steam and the turning of spools. The air smelled of oil and fabric dye instead of wildflowers and rain. Still, there was beauty. On summer evenings, the children would chase lightning bugs through the fields, their laughter echoing against the trees. The air was thick with the scent of hay and honeysuckle. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the horizon glow with the setting sun. The same sun that had once burned on the backs of pioneers now dipped behind telegraph poles and windmills. The world turned, and with every turn, it seemed to grow both wider and smaller. I remember one particular night in 1899. The town gathered in the square for the last dance of the century. Fiddles played, and couples twirled beneath lanterns strung between the trees. I saw faces young and old, some that had been weathered by time, others full of the restless light of the new age. I thought of my father, who had once told me that a man never truly owns his time, he only borrows it for a while. Watching the children dance, I understood what he meant. The world that had been mine was already slipping into their hands. When midnight came, the church bell tolled 12 times, slow and solemn. The air was cold, and the stars above seemed to shiver. Someone began to sing, an old song about hope and home and the passing of years. One by one, voices joined in until the whole town was singing together, carried by the wind into the dark fields beyond. It felt like saying goodbye to something invisible yet deeply real, the century of horses, candles, and wooden floors creaking beneath tired feet. After the song faded, silence settled over the town. The lamps burned low, and people drifted home, laughing softly, holding hands. I lingered in the square a while longer, listening to the faint hum of the electric wires. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistled, a long, mournful sound that seemed to stretch across time itself. And as I walked back to my house, past the sleeping fields and the barn that had seen so many seasons, I thought about how the story of America was like a lantern carried through the dark, each generation holding it for a while before passing it on. The light never truly went out, it only changed hands. The 1800s were ending. The new century waited just beyond the horizon, full of machines, noise, and dreams I could hardly imagine. But in that quiet moment, as frost sparkled on the grass and the stars looked down like old friends, I felt peace. The story of our little town, of love, labor, laughter, and loss, was part of something vast and endless. And though the world would move faster than ever before, I knew that somewhere in the stillness of the night, someone would remember. Someone would whisper the old names, trace the old paths, and feel the same soft ache for the past that I felt then. Because that, I think, is what it truly means to live through history. Not to hold on to it, but to let it live quietly inside you like a flame that never dies.